Hi, Contessas. Welcome to the Career Contessa podcast, your shortcut to being more fulfilled, healthy, and successful at work. I'm your host, Lauren McGoodwin. Today, we're kicking off our new monthly series. It's called 3 in 30. In this series, we will be bringing you 3 tangible tips in 30 minutes or less that you can implement in your career right now. And my co-host for the series is going to sound very familiar, Marnie Lemonik. You guys all know her. She's been on the show before. And she's also a Career Contessa coach who has become, again, like a regular on this podcast. Marnie, I'm so happy you're here.
Hi, everyone. It's Marnie, and in this inaugural episode of 3 in 30, we cover 3 of our favorite interview prep tips. If you have feedback from this episode or you have questions for future ones, feel free to DM me on Instagram. It's at Marnie Lemonik. We will put that in the show notes. And without further ado, let's dive in.
All right. So the first tip that we are focusing on today, because we're talking about interview prep secrets, is number one, focus on the why and the how of your career rather than the what. Let me explain. The biggest mistake we see when it comes to interview prep is giving too much context around a given situation, which again puts way too much focus on sort of you as the candidate versus what has specifically happened to you. And they're probably more interested in that context. This tends to come up in a few different types of answers in a job interview. So we're going to dive into the 2 most common pitfalls to ensure that you know how to make yourself the star of the show. All right. So the first question that you are probably always going to get asked in an interview is tell me about yourself. This is everyone's favorite question. Like I said, it's guaranteed to come up in some capacity. It might also be phrased as, can you run me through your resume? And if you take one nugget away from this episode, remember that this is your time to give the quote story layer of your career and explain why your resume is the way that it is and how it impacted you. This is not the time to run through what is already listed in your resume. They probably have already read it. And as you run through your answer, you should be sharing details that people can't see on your resume. Kind of like you're connecting the dots here. A helpful way to make sure that you avoid going too deep into the quote what is to start your answer with some kind of overarching thesis statement or general theme that has been true throughout your career. You can then anchor your descriptions of your past roles back to that thesis statement. So, for example, when I answered this question in a recent job interview, tell me about yourself, I might say 3 main highlights and then say something like, and the common theme or the thread that ties all those experiences together is XYZ. So that would be the thesis statement. So that common thread or theme that is kind of, again, that thesis that is blending all of these things together. And then once you have queued up your answer, as you describe your career path, keep these quick tips in mind. Number one, if you get easily flustered with this answer, go chronologically, beginning, middle, end, which will keep you organized, and it will also be a natural way for your interviewer to follow along. Number two, you don't need to verbally touch on every role you've ever held in your career. Focus on diving into the roles that are the most relevant to the one that you're interviewing for or the ones that made the biggest impact, aka the ones that taught you those key lessons. And number three, as you describe your moves from one role to the next, provide the why behind your reasoning for transitioning roles and highlight learnings or realizations you had in each role. All right, so those are 3 quick tips for this question that you guys just, it's going to come your way no matter what. And if you have more questions on this very common interview question, tell me about yourself. I will make sure that we put some additional resources from both Marnie and Career Contessa in the show notes so you can dive even deeper just into this specific question. All right, Marnie, I will pass it to you.
Perfect. Let's transition into another big focus that is a really common question, really any form of situational questions, which you might recognize as tell me about a time when. If you are going into these answers with a deep dive on the scenario at hand and you're trying to make sure that the interviewer has all of the context for the specific situation, you're not alone. It's the most common strategy I see when I do interview prep with folks. But ultimately, what you want to remember is the real point of all of these questions is to get a sense of how you think and how you operate. So you don't want to give too many details up front because you want to spend most of your speaking time talking about your actions and your strategy. So in order to help you do this and anchor in something a little bit more tangible, I have a specific example on how you can think about the flow of your answer so that you can ensure you're not giving too much context up front and you're really saving your speaking time for all of the ways that you have shined. So the first thing you want to do is when you start this answer, you want to remember to say what role it actually pertains to. A lot of people get nervous when they answer this question. They're trying to think of a story on the fly and they just dive into the details. But you want to remember to actually orient the interviewer and say, in my most recent role at XYZ company, I was responsible for ABC task. And just that quick single sentence in terms of a format that you can anchor on will make sure that you are always starting in a way that's really organized and confident, which will help carry you through the rest of the answer. Once you give that initial sentence framing everything, the next thing you want to do is describe the situation at hand. Now, this is the piece I was saying people tend to go a little off the rails and they want to give all the details on the specific problem they were dealing with or the tough client that they were addressing. You really want to keep the situation 1 to 2 sentences max. Enough information for someone to be able to follow what you did and why you might be doing those actions, but not too many details to where the focus is pulled off of you. So again, 1 to 2 sentences about the situation at hand in that specific role. Now, after those first 2 beats, we're getting into the really juicy parts, which are about you and all that you've accomplished. So number 3, you want to talk about the actions that you took, and you also want to talk about why you took those actions. So the theme of why is going to be a common through line. Lauren already spoke to this, and tell me about yourself as well. But the ability to explain why you took certain actions is really crucial because it's showing that you have strategic thinking skills and it's showing you know how to operate under pressure, which giving that peek behind the curtain is just so important. You don't want to leave anything up to assumption in terms of why you took a certain action when you did. And last but not least, the 4th key beat, this is my favorite advice to give, is to tie everything together and really say what you learned from the experience or how it impacted you as a professional. So if you can talk about a story where you dealt with conflict, it was obviously something challenging, but you're able to end on a really positive note and say, you know, I learned from this experience. You're always going to come up against these types of conflicts when dealing with clients, but really there can be a silver lining because ABC came from it. Is super impactful because it shows not only, again, that strategic high level thinking, but also frames you as a really positive thinker, which who doesn't want to hire a positive thinker? And I have an exact example of me giving this full answer on my Instagram too, if you want to see it in real time. But if you can remember those 4 beats, it'll really just help you stay organized and not get too rambly, because really that's the name of the game here is we want to be succinct and we don't want to be too long-winded. And like I said, well, obviously, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing I would encourage people to do to prep for this, because these are all really good pieces of advice, is come up with a couple stories. Like think about what are the top 3 or 5 stories or things that you've accomplished at work, and then apply these tips to them. So have those 3 or 5 stories, then apply these tips, and those stories are going to go from being kind of rambling and longer to really succinct and kind of like nailing those high points.
I love that call out. You will save yourself a lot of stress if you know the stories that are in your back pocket because you can flex those to work really around any question that you get. Perfect. Well, let's dive into the questions that you can ask now. So tip number 1 was about how you can answer questions in a really confident light. We're going to transition into how you can ask questions as the interviewee that really enables a 2-way conversation flow in an interview. And I can say from the hiring manager's perspective, leaving an interview and feeling like it was successful is normally just feeling like that was a natural conversation and it flowed. It wasn't a one-way monologue on either end. So if you can remember that you just want to make it a conversation flow, that will also help you fix those nerves, which are a common theme throughout as well. And I think everyone knows at this point, hopefully, that you should be coming with questions at the end of an interview. It shows that you are really interested in the role and that you've done your research. But the piece of advice I want to give here, which is hopefully a little bit different than what you've heard in the past, is you want to bring questions that are really specific to the interviewer's perspective. So this does a few different things for you. It shows that you did research on the company, that person, but it also shows that you really value that person's time. So instead of just pulling the top interview questions from a Google search about any given company that you could ask, you can use these questions as a way to really specify your request to each person and show off the research that you've done. And I want to give you a few concrete examples. The first is thinking about the person's unique experience at the company. So you can do this simply by noting how long they've been at the company or what their role is. A good example of this is, say you're speaking to the hiring manager and they're the ones leading the team. You can say something like, "Oh, as the manager of the team, is there one shared trait that you've noticed all top performers possess?" Something that really frames it to their specific role. You can also think about, okay, what did I learn in my research about the company and how can I pull that in as a lead up to the question? I saw you all recently signed Google as a client, and then ask your question about that specific deal. The last beat you can think about is, what have I learned in previous interview conversations that I can get a different take on in this interview? The ability to pull in nuggets from previous conversations and say, in my first interview with Sally, I learned ABC. Is that true for you as well, or do you have a different perspective on it from your role? That will really show the interviewer that you've tracked everything and that you are paying enough attention and being intentional enough to keep all those thoughts organized.
I love this tip too, because I think the questions you ask at the end of the interview or even throughout the interview, it shows so much. Like there's the person who shows the most basic thing, and you're like, okay, so you don't know anything about our company. Then there's the person who's savvy enough to take their research and blend it into the question. Then there's the person who's able to take something that you've said before and bring it back in the conversation. And I feel like that's like just a different skill level when it comes to interviewing. And really, really good interviewers are able to do that. So these are all such good tips because again, as someone who was a recruiter and hired lots of people and was in those conversations, you can see and feel the difference because the conversation goes a lot deeper. And when you only have maybe 20 or 30 minutes, like you need to stand out quick, So I think these are really good tips. I also just want to mention, if you do want more ideas on interview questions, we will link to Marnie's interview prep ebook in the show notes. And she's also going to be including a discount code for Career Contessa listeners. So again, every tip that we're giving, we're going to provide more resources that you can go deeper on. Okay, Marnie, I'll pass it back to you.
Perfect. Yeah, I think the name of the game here for the questions that you're bringing is really to come similar to the advice Lauren game with the stories, with 3 to 5 that you can have ready to go. And you don't need to use all of them, but if you can be as prepared as possible, you'll just make sure that you're really making the best use of your time. And the other thing that we're going to touch on for questions, which Lauren will dive into, is you can use them not only to find out more information at the end of an interview, but you can also use them throughout your interview to create that natural back and forth conversation.
Absolutely. Okay, moving along to our third and final tip is zoom out a bit to reframe your mindset and inspire confidence. We often think of an interview as a situation where we're being judged heavily, but the reality is that the interviewer is actually predisposed to think highly of you in the way that we don't have in many other type of interactions. So here's something that you can chew on for a second. Number one, when you are doing a first round interview, somebody has already selected you as a qualified person to speak with you based on your resume. That should be a huge confidence boost. And I want you all to remember that. And if you have to write yourself a little hype girl note beforehand, go ahead and do it. Number two, when you are doing a second round interview, your ability to articulate your experience and express your value has already been recognized from your first interview. So the idea that someone has already, quote, opted into your expertise or value before a conversation is kind of rare when you zoom out and you think about the, random interactions that you go through on a daily basis. At the end of the day, an interview is just a conversation with a more structured agenda. I've also heard firsthand and experienced it myself that when you bring that confidence and you bring that kind of mindset, I do think it puts you in a different light in the interview. And it's like you come to it saying, I'm going to engage in a two-way conversation. And part of my goal is to make the other person feel like we are connecting as much as maybe you naturally are connecting. So I think that when you are in a really competitive interview situation, for example, you're going up, maybe you don't know who you're going up against, but you can assume that it was a competitive role and there's probably a lot of incredibly smart, talented people in the interview. Something I want you to focus on is one, reminding yourself that you're a badass, but number two, think about or focus on how you're going to make the interviewer feel, asking them questions about themselves, kind of doing some comparisons of similarities and connecting the dots between them and you. These are all really important things because at the end of the day, it's humans making decisions about another human. And while we do want to give you these tangible tips, I also don't want to ignore like absolute facts that I have seen, which is something that you don't want to forget. Focus on how you make the other person feel as well.
I love that. I think taking it down to the human level really just helps orient you and remind you that it's not that serious at the end of the day. It's obviously high stakes, but you can have that natural connection. Something else I like to remind people of too is interviewing and just overcoming uncomfortable situations is a skill that you're going to build. And this could be said for any part of the job search, but it's really true with interviewing. The more you get used to putting yourself in situations where you're a little bit uncomfortable and you see yourself get through them and even excel in them, the more confidence you will have. So just know that if you're going into an interview and you're nervous, you're in good company. Most people are, but it will also get easier over time.
Absolutely. Okay, we have a little bit of time for some rapid fire. So, Marnie, I know we weren't as prepped for this, but I want to do a little
Yeah.
rapid fire for you of like best way to prep for an interview. Is there a tool or a resource that you love that you use kind of like your go-to?
I love that. I'm a little bit old school in terms of tools and prep. I would say my biggest piece of advice is to definitely make sure that you're investing 10 to 20 minutes per interviewer that you're talking to and going really deep on their experience, just looking at their LinkedIn. It doesn't have to be anything wild, but seeing their path at the company, any overlap that you all have in terms of similar experiences in the past. And then obviously you want to look at the company as well. But the things that I tell people to focus on from the company level specifically are number one, the mission, but not just the mission. I would look at their careers page and see how they frame it in particular, depending on the size of company that you look at. I know Amazon, for example, a lot of their interviews are just centered around their core pillars of their mission, and they ask people to give specific examples for those. So that's never going to be a waste of your time. The other thing that's super quick and easy to do is just Google the company name that you're interviewing with and go to the news tab of the Google search. So you can see any recent articles, which is really important, especially if they signed a big client. Even if they're going through layoffs, you don't need to bring that up in an interview, but things for you to know as the interviewer. Those are just nice quick hits. But my clients who have the most success with interviews, this is not the most glamorous, are really just making a Google Doc with all of that information. And they're also practicing their stories in a really concrete verbal way. So we already said bring 3 to 5 stories that you can have in your back pocket. The ultimate goal is for you to really have confidence with those. I just had a client actually this week who went into an interview. She said it went great. And she said she got some questions that she had never heard before, but she felt super prepared for it because we did enough prep and talked about her stories. So the goal is not for you to prepare for every single question that could be asked. The goal is for you to be so clear on your experience that you can answer any question. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all those tips. I love no, this won't surprise anybody listening, but I really love using ChatGPT. So the way I like to prep and how I did when I was interviewing is I actually used a Google Doc and I like to write out my answers. This is just my thought. This has to be something from like third and fourth grade where I have to like write it out so then I can verbally say it a little bit better. Like
Mm-hmm.
I can't do bullet points. I have to totally write it out. So I used ChatGPT to help me come up with. So I came up with answers for all the like common interview questions, and then I used ChatGPT to come up with specific questions related to that role. Not because I thought like the interviewer will ask me those exact things, but I do think it's helpful. For example, if you're interviewing for content marketing, they're going to ask for something maybe specific to content marketing. And one of the things about coming up with stories is that you need to jog your memory, but the stories have to be able to show a wide variety of skills. And so sometimes I find just looking at the questions, at least ChatGPT, or maybe and you have a friend who's in HR recruiting who might be able to do like a mock interview with you, that's really helpful. For me, I would say the most valuable skill set I had when I was interviewing was having those stories down really, really well, knowing my numbers and not overwhelming the interviewer with so many details that it's like, okay, I've buried the lead, And so it did take me a couple times of practicing my elevator pitch or that tell me about yourself question, especially if you don't have a super linear career path. That is going to be very, very valuable in how you connect the dots from where you've been to why this role. I don't care if it's who you are. If you don't have a good answer to that very first question, I feel like it kind of sets the tone. I also feel like I definitely had an interview where I didn't do a great job answering that question, and I could just kind of like I could feel like the wind sucked out of the sail for me a little bit. Like the rest of the interview just felt a little off, and so I guess want to really emphasize like it's not embarrassing to practice in front of the mirror. It's not embarrassing to say it while you're getting ready in the morning. Like say it while you're driving, like practice these things so they come out really comfortably. Cause I think a lot of people will write this stuff or they might think about it in their head, but actually saying it means a lot and you can kind of finesse some of those bumpy parts. So yeah, I think my best tip is using a tool like ChatGPT or something to come up with the answers, but ultimately you're the one who has to write your answers or like tell your story. So I actually did not use ChatGPT at all to help give me interview answers. I just used it to help me come up with potential questions. And I think your point about like knowing who you're interviewing is really important. And then the last tip I would say that's different, that we haven't mentioned it yet, is the thank you notes. Like send a thank you note, send the people you interview with an email that thanks them. Take notes after your interviews so that, if you don't get this one, you'll have notes and feedback for yourself of how it goes. I mean, it's all a learning process. And I think kind of that continuous learning is important, but also, yeah, it doesn't have to be snail mail. An email is totally fine. And I would always mention one specific thing that you guys talked about and how, and like reassure them that you are interested in the role. People think that's kind of silly because they're like, well, obviously I'm interested in the role. You'd be surprised. And so I feel like you never know. So you should just do it. What do you think, Marnie? Any other hot takes?
I totally agree. I am always surprised when people aren't sending thank you emails. And I've been a hiring manager pretty recently and can confirm that not everyone does it.
No, they don't.
So I always say the same thing, one specific call out in the email, and you can even take notes on your interview and
Yeah.
say, hey, just so you know, I'm taking some notes on my side. That also shows that you care enough to take notes, which can make a really strong impression. And then that way you have really specific call outs. Because I know a lot of us get into an interview, we black out a little bit because we're so nervous, and then we leave and think, what did we even talk about? So don't be afraid to take notes as you're getting answers to those questions.
Yeah. And then I just thought of one other tip that I think is worth mentioning. Body language. Mind your body language.
Mm.
I just had feedback from a hiring manager about two people they interviewed, and one person, the body language was very nervous energy, which I get it. We are nervous, but this is just something to think about. And the other person less so. And I almost feel like when your body language is so loud, it overpowers what you're saying. So two people can be saying the exact same thing, but it's like I've lost my attention because I'm focusing on the fact that your hands are going everywhere or whatever it is. And so I would also encourage you to practice recording yourself in Zoom, having rehearsing your answers or whatever it is, but just mind your body language. You can lose that interview polish very quickly if, there's a distraction like that.
Yeah, the fidgeting, especially spinning around in the chair, is a really common one virtually.
Yeah, and I think people always think it's the ums. It's like the ums are not that bad because somehow they kind of keep flying me. Obviously, if you did it nonstop, it's the fidgeting, it's the playing with your hair. I had a mock interview experience in college where they recorded me and I put my hair behind my ear constantly. Like it was terrible. So I have been there, and I would tell you, sit on your hands if you have to. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, well, I think this is a lot of interview tips, preps, secrets, all that for the very first episode of our new series, which is called 3 and 30. Please let us know what you think of this series. We would love to hear your ideas for future topics and more. You can send us some DMs on Instagram or on LinkedIn. We're active on both of them. Our next episode in this series is actually going to cover signs that you have a good boss, which I feel like people are always so focused on bad bosses, but we're going to put a positive spin on it. And don't forget that we've linked to additional resources for specific tips in the show notes. Plus, Marnie is available for one-on-one career coaching. So if you do need a person to mock interview with you, you can book with her. She's your girl. And then thank you again for listening to this episode of the Career Contessa podcast. Please take your time to rate, review, and subscribe. Little insider tip, one review equals about 1,000 new downloads. And that's the number one way that you can support our show so we can be back here each week.